I got to learn Rekha Basu. I got to learn how to say that. I said one time when our committee was meeting, and we said, well, who can we get for a forum? Who can we get? And I just kind of jokingly said, boy, it wouldn't be fun to get Rekha. You know, and we said, okay, so I messaged her, and she just said, sure. And you could have knocked me over with a feather. You know? So, but I'm sure, for those of you who don't know who she is, I'm so sorry. She worked for the Des Moines Register for about 30 years as a columnist, editorial writer, journalist. And I looked up, and you did 5,000 articles in the paper. Okay, well, it said 5,000, and she is not shy about speaking her piece. And in fact, let's see, are you going to stand up here with the mic? She likes to have an interactive group, and she has some things to say. But actually, I'm going to ask you my first question. I thought of this because when I was looking and I was reading your bio and everything, back in the day when you were writing the columns, and I'm sure sometimes you got some hate mail and boxes. But my question would be, you know, today there's so much hate in the world and so much, you know, if I'm right, you must be totally wrong. And there's so much hate and attacking and everything. Is the tone of the hate mail different than it was back then?
It's not any different, really. Is this
Can
on?
you hear her?
Can you hear me?
We're streaming. Oh, hello from home. So,
okay. I wouldn't say that the
on,
tone...
Peggy? No, it's not on.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Raise it. I usually don't have to raise the mic much. I'm pretty short. I would say that there's more misinformation on the internet now than what came at me when I was getting hate mail. But I would say the tone has continued to be as vitriolic. And what worries me is it took me a long time, frankly, to develop a thick enough skin that I could take it. At first, you know, you just want to crawl into a hole and believe what these people are saying about you, that, you know, you're this horrendous monster that emerged from the sea and that you should just get on a bus, slow boat, go back to India, whatever. But I think about the younger people who are especially affected by this online now, especially in schools where there is this kind of online chat against them, targeting them. And you hear about the number of suicides that are being committed because of what's being said about people. And it really worries me because I had a process and I also had a lot of affirmation. I was being paid to write my views, right? But for a lot of these people, there is no affirmation. And so they believe what's being said about them, and they're at these very vulnerable ages when it really can affect their sense of self. So I worry about that a lot. So that's a background way of talking about myself, but I want to thank you so much for having me here. I'm really blown away to have been invited, frankly. And I heard from some of the concluding remarks in the service that I'm very much in the right place. I feel very welcome here. I feel as if we're on the same page in terms of our basic values about the importance of inclusiveness and public education, which is a very big topic for me right now. I just came back from spending a month with my 20-month-old grandbaby in Baltimore, my first grandchild. And this is a luxury because I just retired from my job in December. So I can go there, and I must say it was, as we were just talking, Christy and I, it's exhausting to be with a 20-month-old when you're in your late 60s, as many of you perhaps know. But it also shows the light that sometimes is missing from our public discourse, and especially with some of what has been going on politically in Iowa right now. You know, you just want to run away and put the pillow over your head and say, stop it, no more, no more. And I just, by indulging myself in time, quality time with this pure little soul who doesn't know meanness, who doesn't know hatred, who doesn't know political maneuvering and machinations, who is just real and loving and open to the world, it really put me in a good place. And I just returned last night. So I'm very happy to be with you all in another good place. So it feels wonderful to be here. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the sort of erosion of democracy that I see happening in our state these days, and especially after this last election, when the governor and the legislature and the Republicans in general won a supermajority. But I want to preface this by saying to you, I've never been registered with a political party. I don't identify as a Democrat or a Republican. It's always been part of my job to be non-aligned. So I've never been, journalists who write about these issues are not allowed to vote in caucuses. So I've never registered as a Democrat, for example. But I have always been progressive in my views about social justice issues, and that's the place I'm coming from. So if it sounds like I'm picking on Republicans, please know I'm not picking on the Republican Party in general as it used to be. I'm picking on where it is right now in the Trumpster mode. And if any of you are Trump supporters, I'd love to hear back from you, actually, where I'm wrong. So I feel that what has happened, and by the way, I loved Bob Ray, and he was a friend of mine. Joy Corning was a really close friend of mine. And there have been so many Republicans who I have really, really admired and revered in Iowa history, but I don't see that spirit of bipartisanship anymore in the legislature, and that's what's really riling me. What I'm doing these days as my form of therapy is I'm co-hosting a podcast with my dear friend Julie Gamak, who was once a registered columnist and has done many other things. You probably heard of her. She was a WHO talk show host back in the day in the late 1980s. And so she and I have started a podcast. I won't even tell you the title of it because it's a bit off color. But the question is, what has happened to Iowa? What happened to Iowa? And so we look at issues like public education, the state of public education, the state of the environment, this intense baiting of transgender people and bathroom use and that sort of thing. So what our goal is to try and push Iowa back to the way it used to be, where people could get along in spite of party and come to common ground on issues that involve moral conviction for the greatest of us, the most of us. One thing I see happening here, and this really is confusing to me, and maybe all of you can help me actually speak to this issue, is that what I see from politicians is a lot of mixing up of church and state where it doesn't belong, right? And so then my question to you all is, do you feel that as people of faith, you have a role and a right to encroach into the political territory in churches in ways that you didn't in the past, and use religion actually as a way to respond to what is being done in the name of religion, like this pushback against transgender people? What is the role of people of faith in a time like this? This is the question that really I would love to hear from all of you about as we talk further. But first I want to make this interactive, so I'm going to throw out a couple of questions. And I want to just share with you, basically my concerns fall into these following areas. I'm one of them, and this is in no particular order. One of them is on this war with the media that is being waged by people in power, that there are no longer press conferences held by the governor, that the media is demonized even when we are doing endorsement, editorial board interviews, and we invite, it's been a long tradition that people who are running for high office would come in and meet with our editorial board at the Register. The governor won't do that anymore. She won't talk to us. She won't answer our questions. The press is no longer allowed to have a special space in the legislative floor. They have to go up to the high areas where, where regular visitors sit, so that they don't have good access. And recently there was a case that you may have read about in the media, and we'll talk about that more, in which the governor was found responsible for having withheld public information that should have been and would have been deemed public under the laws. So that's number one. I'm very concerned about the privatization of public schools and the move to dictate from government what is taught and what is not taught. The notion that diversity of various kinds is bad, that gender nonconformity is banned, and yet calling it out in the name of parental rights when it suits an agenda, but not allowing for parental rights when it doesn't suit another agenda. It's a very cloudy message, I feel. The consolidation of power in the hands of one leader, in a way that has taken away, there's been a great constriction of the number of different agencies in state government, and they're all now answerable to one person, the governor. And this is, the kind of thing that you see in totalitarian states, frankly. And I just worry, and also about the media. Newspapers have traditionally been largely dependent for their income on public legal notices, right, which are printed in the newspaper. They bring in a fair amount of revenue. Now the state is trying to take that away from newspapers and publish everything online for free for these advertisers, so that the Register would lose huge, and all newspapers would lose a huge amount of what is their regular income stream. So what would happen to papers? Well, I think, frankly, they'd be a lot happier without them. And I think that's another issue we could talk about all day, about the constriction of news media and the proliferation, frankly, of real far right-wing talk radio in these parts of Iowa where there isn't a daily newspaper anymore, which is where I think a lot of people are getting their views shaped. The diminishing or derailing government watchdog role, what's happening with the state auditor, not being allowed to do his job anymore, and the derailing of legislative bills, the derailing of discussion about legislative bills, I should say, with members of the opposing party when questions are asked. All of this I will address. But I thought I would throw out a few quotes here. This is kind of a game we'll play, and ask you if you can identify either who the speaker was or what was being discussed. And this has all been in the news recently, newspapers. So here's one. This bill is the greatest pro-corruption bill in state history and the worst perversion of checks and balances in Iowa history. Anybody know? Yes. Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Okay. What? Oh, Rob Sand, right? State auditor. So you know all of this. He said that in a news conference after the Iowa House voted to block his office from going to court against state government agencies and restricted it from accessing certain types of personal information, including medical and counselor records, students' educational records, peace officers' reports, and attorney work products. So Republicans argue, and Rob Sand, as we all know, is the only statewide elected Democrat since the last election. There are no others in office. So Republicans argue that the limits on the auditor's office are necessary to protect Iowans' privacy. Democrats and a bipartisan group of state auditors around the country counter that the bill would hamper the auditor's independence and limit his office's ability to oversee more than $12 billion in taxpayer-funded programs, potentially putting some of that at risk. Rob Sand has been criticized by Republicans for conducting investigations into Governor Kim Reynolds' administration. Okay, this might be a little harder. What was this statement made in reference to? Power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is an absolute corruption of the foundation of the way we govern ourselves in a democracy. This was, no, but it was Mike Owen, Deputy Director of Common Good, Iowa. So what was the context? Actually, no, it was over something I referenced earlier. He was responding to Senate Republicans' new limits on debate over a bill, such as when a member of the majority party is asked by a minority member to defend the potential negative consequences of the law that is being proposed. So the legislature has decided to limit what they say publicly in discussion of potential legislation in support or against it, because it could become part of the public record. And if they were wrong on the facts, that could later be used against them. Now, I ask you, shouldn't they be right on the facts? And shouldn't it be used against them if they were wrong on the facts and you're debating an issue in which they spoke publicly inaccurately about the facts? So this issue came up on April 17th when the Senate was considering a bill to loosen restrictions on and protections for children in the workplace. We're bringing back child labor also in Iowa. And the Republican floor manager of the bill and the Senate Majority Leader refused to answer a question from a Democrat, an unprecedented response. Well, the senators resorted to this new stance of failing to discuss a proposal after the Iowa Supreme Court issued an opinion that quoted, on another issue, that quoted from a Senate floor debate. It was a budget bill, and the court's opinion, quoting from a Republican senator, said that he, the senator, had falsely represented the bill and its level of support and showed no knowledge of the bill's history, so that legislators were unsure of what they were even voting on. I mean, that should be basic, folks. That should really be elementary to know what you're talking about when you're proposing a law. Okay, let's do some more. Neither the justices, Supreme Court staff, or judicial branch building security knew or gave permission for the governor or the Iowa State Highway Patrol to access the Supreme Court's non-public office space at or about the time their case was set for oral argument. So very good, very good. And this was the council. You're well up on the news. Thank you. Thank you for keeping our paper alive. You may be one of the few people who's doing it. So this was the counsel to the Iowa Supreme Court's Chief Justice in a letter notifying lawyers about an incident involving the governor on the day last month when the Supreme Court heard arguments in a case involving abortion, on which Governor Reynolds is the lead plaintiff. Now, for background, under current law, abortions are legal in Iowa, you all know this, until 20 weeks of pregnancy. But the governor previously signed a fetal heartbeat law and sought to ban abortions after 6 weeks. And it's been on hold because of court rulings. A district court judge ruled in December that a permanent injunction on the law would remain. But the governor appealed that to the Supreme Court. And on the day of that hearing, though, there was no role for her to play in court at all and no need for her presence. Governor Reynolds took the unprecedented step of using the State Highway Patrol to escort her to the courtroom through a private entrance where the justices have their offices. And then she sat in the front row facing the justices as they heard the arguments in a way that might suggest an effort to intimidate or coerce them to vote her way. Recently, Governor Reynolds said at the Iowa Faith and Freedom Coalition event, which hosted Republican candidates for president here in Iowa, "I will not rest until Iowa's courts allow the will of the people to finally take effect, until every unborn child has the chance to experience the greatest gift that our Lord endowed upon us, life." I mean, we were just talking about misinformation. Actually, the will of the people, a majority of Iowans support the right to an abortion. So that is a clear misstatement of fact intended to manipulate. Let me throw out a couple more quotes. Okay. This session will go down in history as one of the most divisive and cruel ever seen in the history of the Iowa legislature. Said that. Really? It's a state legislature. It's the Senate Minority Leader, Zach Walz. Okay, what was he talking about? Well, maybe this next quote from former Vice President Mike Pence at the same Iowa Faith and Freedom event that the governor intended will give you some idea. The battle against radical gender ideology is a battle for religious freedom, and it's a battle we must fight. So that's the former vice president. He was criticizing the Linn-Mar School District for having had a policy that allowed transgender students to request accommodations without getting parental consent to use the bathroom of their choice. Since then, the legislature has passed and the governor has signed bills that penalize transgender students in one way or another. One prohibits parents from getting gender-affirming care for their transgender children under the age of 18. And it bars transgender kids from using school bathrooms that align with their gender identity. It also limited any instruction relating to gender identity or sexual orientation through 6th grade and requires school administrators to inform a student's parents if the student requests to use a different pronoun at school. Imagine what the potential consequences of that could be if the parent is not friendly, if it's not an LGBT-friendly household. Ironically, it also passed Senate File, so the legislature also passed Senate File 496, which codifies parental rights, stating that Iowa parents have the fundamental constitutionally protected right to make decisions regarding the education, religious and moral upbringing, or medical care for their child under 18. So on the one hand, parents are not allowed to give doctors or children the permission to do gender transformation surgery, transition surgery, but on the other hand, there should be this fundamental parental right to decide stuff for their children, except when it offends the ideology of those in power. And let's not forget, while the lawmakers claim to be so concerned with the welfare of children who are not transgender, it also passed a bill that lets teenagers work longer hours and lets 16 and 17-year-olds serve alcohol in restaurants with a parent's permission, and to work in some currently prohibited jobs as part of a work-based learning program. Here's something that you will certainly know the context for. A quote, "America is no stranger to censorship and book banning in the name of ideology, usually cloaked in the self-righteous guise of Christian values and decency." What was being discussed? Well, I guess we just discussed it. So, new legislation not yet signed into law, I believe, removes school books depicting sex acts and explicitly states that parents have a constitutionally protected right to make decisions for their children. I mean, there we go again, the double standard. There would be consequences leveled by the state against a teacher, librarian, or school that knowingly violated that section. One part that should be of special concern is that in 7th and 8th grade, schools could not teach about HIV prevention or the existence, even the existence, much less having to have it, of a vaccine against HPV. Some of what's worrisome here is that some of these measures seem to be religious-based ideological stances, which put the state in the role of dictating personal and familial morals while ignoring other risks to children. So how are we doing on time? I could talk all day, but as you can see, there's a lot of other issues that we could cover, but you know most of this stuff. So if you would like to ask me questions or have a discussion about something else, please, let's use the time.
Mike, okay. I haven't been at church in a while.
Welcome.
Basically just came for Ms. Basu. There's a famous statement about the banality of evil, where most evil happens because people don't do anything. And I've also heard an altered version of that, where most evil happens because people just want to pay rent. So, I guess what I'm saying, it's easy to say that we should go out and protest, go out and vote, go out and make our voices heard, but for my generation and younger, who have to hold down a job, who have to worry about losing their job or losing their home, because they may have made too much of a scene in the public, what is the outlet, what is the solution for us? How do we stand up against this without risking our livelihood?
Thank you so much for that question. That is an excellent question, and it should be asked all the time. I think that it's a really tough balancing act, and where I think the Democrats have really failed this time around, or I guess right before the last election, was in making this election personal to people in all walks of life and at all stages of life, and going out and explaining to people exactly what is at stake. Because you're right, when people are working long hours or have little children to take care of at home and don't have a lot of money to put food on the table, who wants to be wrapped up in politics? It's a messy business, and you think, it's all the same. Nothing is going to change my life for the better, right? What you need is someone to tell you exactly what is at stake and how actually your life could be so much better if the right policies were enacted that actually paid for childcare, so that you didn't have to be working these late hours and then turn around and come home and take care of your kids, or the other way around. I mean, look at what is happening to to just basic things like feeding people who don't have money. That's being taken away from us. And I think the Democrats were not savvy. Or look at the minimum wage. It's $7.25 an hour in Iowa. Who can survive on that, right? But they don't bring up these fundamental issues because I think too many Democrats are too concerned about seeming more middle of the road so that they can bring people over from the other side. Well, forget about the MAGA people. Forget about them. You know, go to working people or people who can't find a job or can't make it on their pay and tell them what's at stake and take them to the polling station. Tell them, have candidates come and speak to them. That's what parties need to be doing. That's what grassroots organizing needs to be about. So I don't blame people who don't turn up to vote. I totally get what you're saying. It's incumbent upon those who are running for office and supporting, you know, to putting people in office to do that kind of hard work. And really, thank you for that question. At what? Yes, yeah. Right, exactly. I think that Republicans won for a reason. They had their acts together. You know, especially these kinds of Republicans. One of the things that really is disturbing, though, is there's no independent Republican anymore, right? I mean, they're all now cut from the Trumpian cloth. And so you can't really be a Republican everything that Kim Reynolds has done here has already been done in Florida. But she was boasting on a news show recently that I saw on TV about how they were in competition, she and Ron DeSantis from Florida, about who can get these things done first. So it's all about national standing. They don't care about the people of Iowa with these kinds of measures. Yes.
First of all, it's kind of hard for us to hear folks who don't use the microphone like this. So if they could just please eat the microphone.
That probably includes me, right?
So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I sympathize entirely, of course, with your comments on minimum wage. And I'm a retired pastor. And when we try to support our staff, we are literally at the mercy of the congregation and its ability to raise funds for that staff. I served a church late in my career that had 3 other staff members in the office that I sat in, and they were not they were at minimum wage, which as you pointed out is not enough to support a household. And when people were talking about raising the minimum wage, even doubling it to something that would be acceptable, I felt torn about that because, on the one hand, I would have liked to have doubled what my staff was earning, but to do that overnight with any congregation is a tough thing to do. Can you speak to those instances like with churches or other organizations that find it difficult to even support a minimum wage for their staff?
So I would ask you, and I totally empathize with the problem. I would ask you this: how much? And I don't know much about church funding. I don't belong to a church. I'm not actually Christian. I'm agnostic. I was born half Hindu and half Sikh to Indian parents who came from different religions, and I've always embraced all and rejected a lot of what came from most. So how much funding do you get from the National Methodist organization, or is it all locally raised? I see. So it's not something you've tried to do because you don't think that it would support staff. Okay. What about in other countries? What about in Europe, for example? Where does the funding come from I don't know that, actually. Does it come from the state for churches, really? Does anyone else know? Yeah.
I have a question. I do not know the answer to your thing. I think it's just for pastors, though, too, the extra money. I spent way too much time at the Capitol this year, and one of the days I was there, I could not believe that I was listening to a conversation about Caesar and Jesus at this, and everybody had a Bible that day, and I came home and I said, oh my gosh, there were more Bibles in the Capitol than there are
in church.
You know, and I wasn't sure if I should feel bad about that or not. I didn't, but yeah, I wanted to kind of update you on. I have in my hand the social principles of the United Methodist Church because I used it for a prop when I was talking about public education.
Mm-hmm.
This is where we are on church and state. The United Methodist Church has for many years supported the separation of church and state. The state should not use its authority to promote particular religious beliefs, nor should it require prayer or worship in the public schools, but it should leave students free to practice their own religious convictions. We believe that the state should not attempt to control the church, nor should the church seek to dominate the state. So that's where we are.
So that's interesting because in privatizing public education, right, the governor contends that she's not running afoul, or at least her people contend that they're not running afoul of the constitutional separation of church and state, because when they give, what is it, $7,000 per pupil to transfer from a public school to a private, which in Iowa really equals religious school. There are very few non-public schools that don't have a religious bearing. So the money is going to the family and not to the school. That's how it's paid. It's paid to the family and it goes with the child. So even though it's state government money that's going to a parochial school, that's okay because they're the family is the middle person, which is I mean, just so disingenuous, I think, to put it that way. Of course they are. Right. And the other thing about it, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, is that parochial schools, first of all, can turn down anybody they want to. They can turn down transgender people. They can turn down people who have disabilities of various kinds, and they can also kick them out if they're not behaving properly, right? So the way the funding is to be set up is that the money goes to that school initially at the outset of the semester, before the semester, then they kick them out, then they go back, that kid has to go back to public school, right? But the public school has already lost the funding for that student. So it's just a way of funneling more money to private education. This is so disingenuous. Yes.
I work with homelessness as my...
Can you talk a little louder, sorry, or eat the mic, as he said?
I don't think... Okay, is that better? Okay.
Yes, much
I had
better.
it turned the other way. Anyway, I work with homelessness on my regular day job, and one of the things that we're really focused on this year was a bill with eviction expungement. And eviction expungement would allow people that have a dismissed or an eviction that happened 20 years ago, right, to be able to have that removed from the records. We had sponsors from the Republicans that worked with that, a couple that are really important. In fact, we had lobbyist support from the ACLU and the Family Leader Foundation, right? Like, we covered the gambit. But it still came down to one committee vote, and if they'd held the vote and not pulled it, it would have passed 16-2. But from what we're aware of, like, we don't know for sure, right? But what we think is that it was like two individuals. So I think we did the whole aspect of, I had emails across the state. We did the whole basic things. Like, I've had some folks like, you and the group did everything right? But it's still that frustration of, like, two individuals can slow that down. So maybe I'm just storytelling and as opposed to asking a question.
No,
but
this is really, I'm glad you're bringing this up.
But yeah, it's just really challenging when you can have one or two people stop it passed the House 95-0, right? And so it's just really challenging from that perspective about doing the work and still feeling like it's it's stopped by a couple individuals, right? We're going to still continue the work, right? Because it's still very, very important to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's those challenges, and then you talked about the hypocrisy of, it's okay for families to get private education information and help, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to worry about whatever your income is.
Right.
But if you get SNAP benefits, we got to make sure that you don't have 2 cars, that you have all these different pieces, right? So I'm challenged by that, or just that concept of, how about the fact that we don't need to judge, and because you're a human being, you deserve to be able to have
And actually,
freedom.
what they did on this SNAP bill, or what they were trying to do, and it got changed a little bit by the time it passed, was degrade people for wanting to eat meat that was fresh and not frozen. No, you have to eat frozen chicken. You can't just buy fresh chicken. Who do you think you are? Or something about white bread, that it had to be white bread or not white bread, or fresh fruit and vegetables had to be limited. I mean, what? Don't you want people to be healthy? Don't you want poor people to be healthier and be eating healthy? It is just so much of it is for show value, to act as if they're not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, so they should be punished in the kind of food that they're allowed to buy at the supermarket. Now, as for the other point that you were talking about, they pulled the bill, you said, right? They pulled it. This is an area that is so rife for corruption, because there was another case that happened, and I was going to talk about it today. It was coming up while I was doing research for this. Was that there was one lawmaker who was managing a bill, and it involved a pipeline issue, and his former employer opposed the bill, and it had to do with granting eminent domain, right? And he just refused to put it to a vote, and then it turned out that it was his former employer that was deciding, based on their economic interests. I think this kind of stuff is happening all the time. And people are basically allowing bills to move forward or not move forward, even though there may be a majority of support for one, because of their own personal or economic interests. And it's a travesty. Good question. Good question. Thank you for bringing that up. How frustrating. Yes.
I think you may have moved to Des Moines at roughly the same time we did. We came in 1994. And one of the reasons we moved to Iowa was we had two really small children, and Iowa's had a reputation of having a wonderful education.
Yes.
I mean, they did. What I wonder is, as Iowa's population is aging, does our government understand that these these policies that are not friendly, like the privatizing education and all of that, I could make a list, are not attractive to people moving to the state? That makes the state a very unattractive place to live, to the point that if we had to make that decision today, we would not move to Iowa.
Wow. And I've heard a lot of people who say that. And look at the parents of transgender teenagers who are saying they're moving out of state because they cannot manage these policies. I mean, there is one school of thought that actually believes that the governor and legislature don't want people to move to Iowa. They really don't. They want to keep it small, and they want to be able to keep it under their thumb. And they're not interested in really building more industry or in competition. They think it's just fine the way it is. But I think public education is also a big thing that kept me here. I mean, I moved here for a job, but my kids were too young to even be going to school. They had, daycare at that time. And in fact, someone took us to look at a house to live in and said it's the area near Roosevelt High School. Your kids will love it. And we said, we're not going to be here when they're in high school. So now they're 33 and 36, and they graduated from Roosevelt and went on many places. But yeah, I mean, there was so many things about the quality of life here that were attractive then. And one of them was the friendliness of people. And now people are at each other. You can't even go to dinner parties with people of the other party because, it leads to a lot of either repressed tension about what you cannot say or outright warfare across the dinner table. I'm with you completely. Hi.
Hi, sorry to go back to the other issue you were talking about before, but one thing that I'm happy about, the U card.
The do card?
U card, I'll just be honest here, but my husband lost most of his vision 12 years ago. He had to go on 13, I think. he had to go on disability. And so with some changes in food stamps, with it going back down after COVID, one nice thing is it's called the U-Card Medicaid benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to just cover, excuse me, it used to just cover medications like Walgreens and things, which is nice because then you don't have the out-of-pocket expense.
Mm-hmm.
But now, and I really think that some of the insurance affiliates are really trying to be on top of things. They are coming out for visits, trying to figure out what do these people still need for assistance. They're AmeriGroup. They're calling. That is positive to me.
That's
But
wonderful.
now the U card. Now it depends on if you have which insurance you have. Sometimes you can even use it for rent. Toward rent.
Wonderful.
Like, I don't know. I'm sure the benefit changes depending on your family situation, but even if it's only a couple $100 a month, you can use it for utility. It depends on which plan you pick. You can either use it for food and medication, or you can use it toward utilities and rent, depending on which insurance. Wow. That's an extra couple $100 a month, because most folks that are not wealthy, that are on food stamps, on disability, whatever, at the end of the month, when you're wondering, what are we going to do, for the end of the, like probably the last week and a half is hard for people on food stamps and things before it gets renewed again. Now, and you can go to Hy-Vee, Walmart, Target, and Walgreens and CVS to get either medications, at least the plan that we have, medications or food. I think that's a good thing.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I was not aware of that.
It's called the U-Card.
So was there a political force behind making this happen?
Well,
and which was it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder if the federal government had something to do.
Well, I think probably what it is, Medicaid. I think I know what you're talking about. So the service providers or the entities that have chosen that can design some of their plans, and I think in the long run, keeping someone housed will keep them more healthy, and so they have a little bit of flexibility in their payment that they get, right, to be able to use it for some of those different things, some of those different tools. So it just depends what Medicaid provider that you have and how they utilize those resources.
Eat the mic.
you can only use it, and we try not to joke a little bit, but you can only use it for healthy food.
That's
So
great.
I said, we don't buy a lot of chips and things, but, I have a teenager. It's like, but you can only use it for meat, vegetables, good.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We don't need to be buying Ruffles,
Well, that's
I like-
really
I like
good, and
Ruffles, yeah.
I'm glad that you brought that up. When did that go into effect, the U card? How long has it been? Probably. I'm going to look into that, though. Thank you for bringing that up.
We probably have about 5 or so more minutes.
Okay.
I get to you, Carl. When you talk about separation of church and state, that gets tricky because, in my viewpoint, my observation is the evangelical, conservative, faith communities are definitely, in politics. We can't have same-sex marriage because it goes against my beliefs and my church, and they can preach that stuff. So what's the future of separating church and state?
So, that's a really good question. Financially, it's a big issue, right? But, when I heard, I was so happy. I was taking pictures of the screen earlier when, there was conversation about supporting public education and seeing people wear these scarves that, you said you went through the process of becoming an open and reconciling congregation, which is wonderful. But that becomes politics too, to a certain extent, because these issues are always up for debate. These kinds of issues we've been talking about are up for debate in the legislature. So what is the dividing line? And I want to hear from all of you your thoughts about that. What should be allowed? What shouldn't be?
Well, that was what I was going to talk about. Christy jumped in with perfect segue. The groups like the Interfaith Alliance are churches, and with a direct political lobbying efforts and so on. Connie Ryan does a great job with that. And then we as a congregation have for years had a table at the Governor's Conference for LGBTQ youth and at the GSA conference and all those. They know us and we know them. This last one, there were 800 kids registered. It was terrific day, and that sort of thing, putting the church out there as an example maybe, and we're not out there proselytizing or evangelizing or anything else. What we do is offer a brochure with faith communities like ours that are in fact open and affirming or reconciling, that practice what they preach, for students if they're interested in looking for a faith community have it. But even more important, just knowing there are people out there in groups that they're used to being rejected by, that are actually on their side. So that's one way to do it. And yes, it's political, and we know that. So you do that. You do what you can.
And also you mentioned, Christy, evangelical. Now evangelical for some of us progressive people has sort of become a bad word because the proselytizing is all hate, based. But someone was bringing up the idea that Jimmy Carter was one of the evangelists who was really progressive. And right? I mean, it can go both ways. Mm-hmm. So there's that.
When you talk about the schools, Rekha, I'll share a story that I had told her. My son, Steve Brown, coached her son, Raj, at Roosevelt cross country. But he teaches at Adele now. But I've shared this with a few people. I think it was last fall, or maybe last year. Anyway, one of his students, he teaches a science class. One of his students said, "How does the COVID vaccine work?" And Steve said, "We're not going to talk about the COVID vaccine. Let's talk about how vaccines work." So he kind of had a study about how vaccines work. The very next day, the principal came to him and said, "Don't do that again." A parent complained that Steve was promoting COVID vaccine. So this is what teachers are facing.
Are there any teachers here in this group? I'd like to hear from you. What are you feeling? What are you facing?
I've been a teacher for over 30 years in several different capacities, music, teacher coach, but I missed the kids too much. I came back to the classroom. I'm really frustrated and concerned. There's so much going on in schools that they're asking us to do more and more, and you hear that in the news, but it's for real. It really is for real. I've made my own parameters of I can't do this, I can't do this. We are losing so many good teachers. So many good teachers. And I don't know what to do. Our education system it's awful. I'm just frustrated because of the loss that we have. They're providing incentives. If I didn't have to teach right now, I wouldn't, because of all the extra stuff. And that's not fair to the kids. That's not fair to my classroom of kids.
Question. I've heard from various teachers who I am close with that in the classroom it's just really difficult sometimes to control the kids, that their just behavior is out of control and they speak back and they're always on their cell phones and all of this stuff. And this is exactly the kind of rhetoric that the governor is using to push private education. Is it true that things are that bad in public schools? And
yes.
If so, what should be done that's not being done? More money, for one thing. I imagine not taking it away.
Yes.
Right?
Whereas I have not gotten a raise for 8 years now because I'm at the end a master's plus 45. I haven't gotten a raise, but that is the biggest problem this year in my class. Is there's so many mental issues with kids. I've never had a class like this that talks back. These are fourth graders. These are 9 and 10-year-olds. So it is that bad, and I don't have the worst of it.
Anxiety of teachers or of student? Everyone. Yes, there's someone in the back there that. Okay. How about that? Yeah, I'm sure you can.
I'm Becky. I teach 6th grade, and I teach an elective, so honestly, I have them for 45 minutes every other day, and that is what's keeping me sane, because I can kind of be like, I have you for 45 minutes every other day, and then I can bless and release you to other places. But there are teachers who teach English that have the same kids 2 blocks all year long, elementary teachers that have them, and dealing with so many behavior issues that we have. You know, we have a building helper that gets called to rooms to help with classroom behaviors, and part of it is parents that don't help out either. We have one student that when he has behavior issues and has to go home, the assistant principal just has to drive him home because his parents won't answer the phone to come get him for behavior issues, and it just disrupts. And it's unfortunate because it is a minority of students, in my school at least, that make it difficult for the majority of students. Like, I've been thinking, we had a speaker come that talked about like where teachers give their attention to. You know, we talk about pay attention and things like that, and it has kind of haunted me that I have to give or pay so much attention to some of the few amount of students in my class that cause such disruptive behaviors, that the majority of students who are doing the right thing lose out on so much from me because of that. I had a student this year who I emailed home about a behavior, and when the student was in the passing period, they texted their mom saying that they didn't do it and that it wasn't them, and the mom showed up after school at the end of the day demanding to talk to me, demanding to talk to someone. And this is my 15th year of teaching, but I will say, like, it has changed such drastically in the 15 years. We have people that are leaving all the time too. At the end of this school year, we have a family and consumer science position we can't fill. Our librarians leaving because they're going to be forced to serve in 3 different buildings. Next year, all of our teachers are going to have to cover a study hall because we're cutting funding, and we are going to cut like our study hall teachers to save money. So we're like losing a planning period. So it is. I'm here still, but sometimes I wonder why I am.
So why wouldn't parents reading this, or prospective parents, say, "Oh, I'm just going to enroll my kids in private school where they can keep out
kicked
the
out and they get
riffraff,
sent back
quote,
to
unquote."
us. We've had kids that get kicked out of private school and get sent to us.
Have you really?
Yeah.
That have come back to you?
Yep.
Do you, I mean, I hate to bring this up, and this is an issue that we didn't get into in this talk because there are just too many issues, but the gun issue, right? I mean, is it at the point where you worry? Every week now, it seems, we hear about some kid bringing a gun to school in some city somewhere, and, you know, a friend was saying to me yesterday, thank God we don't have to worry about that here. And I was thinking, well, you know, we do. We do, right? I'm so sorry to hear that.
Well,
on that discouraging note, well, I mean, yeah, right, exactly.
In my mind this morning, I thought, well, Rekha's going to be in a good mood today because you just spent days with your
with my grandbaby,
yeah,
who will also be going to school someday, and you know, we have to worry about these very same issues.
Yeah.
But I mean, I really want to thank all of you who showed up here today for using your voices and for speaking truth to power and for spreading awareness about these issues. It is really wonderful to see a church group that cares so much about justice.
Well, let me share one thing with you. On a regular basis, when the legislature is in session, we have one member, Jean, right there with the scarf on. She sends out a regular email to those who say they want it. And she tells what bills are coming up, and what they say, and then she gives us what we could say to our legislators. As a person of faith, please don't vote for such and here's why. And she does that, you know, on a regular basis while the legislature is in session, encouraging us to contact our
Wonderful.
our senators. And,
I would love to get your newsletter when they're back in session, but quite frankly, I'm so relieved they're not in session anymore. I mean, for you must be more than anybody, right? It's just...
Well, let's give Rekha, of course, the big round of
Thank
applause.
you. Thanks to you. Thank you so much.
To be honest, I'm not sure a lot of churches would do this kind of thing. I want to believe that. But I so appreciate Rekha. Like I said, you could have knocked me over with a feather when you replied that quick, said, sure. So,
and it's been wonderful. It really has been.